Okay, so here's Francis, who's going to, I'm sure, absolutely fascinate us. You've all seen the details about her rough details about her life in WOW, but I just want to stress Pinter Publishing, a really innovative development. I mean, wonderful publishing, but the really exciting thing about Pinter Publishing, that it was done by a relatively young woman, set up on her own. Now, today we're used to that, aren't we? You know, there's lots of small publishers today out in the market, but at that time there weren't. There were the big guys, but not new people specialising. So it was really innovative, and I think was followed up by the other great innovative thing that she did, which was in 1992 when she set up the Central European University Press in Budapest. So she's a good girl, and she's going to talk to us.
Thank you very much. Is this working? Can you hear me?
No. Yes.
Okay. Excellent. I should come more. I should bring it. Okay. Good. Even closer. Okay. Well, I'm delighted to be here, and in a moment you're going to know why. So, I'd like to take you all back to the early 80s. Early 80s at a place called the Savile Club in the central part of London. This was one of those gentlemen's only clubs that one hears about. And it was a monthly meeting of the Society of Book Men. Emphasis on men, book men. And they would meet up once a month and have a nice dinner and a speaker, usually a man. Only this time, this is a little bit unusual. And the reason it was unusual was because they had a female speaker, a senior executive, no less. And she was a woman and a high flyer. And because there was a woman speaker, many of the men, members of the Society of Book Men, decided they needed to bring a woman guest. So I was the guest of the president of the Booksellers Association, and well, how cool was that as a young publisher to be taken to the Savile Club? Well, there are two things that I remember from that dinner. One was the speaker. She began telling the audience that actually what she did in publishing was not sit around reading great manuscripts, but actually checking the Financial Times, looking at exchange rates, worrying about money, and I thought this was wonderful. And in the Q&A, a woman editor stood up and said, "Oh, all I want out of publishing is to work with wonderful manuscripts and wonderful authors, and I'm sure that's what most women want to do." Not for her were things like currency exchange or debt swaps, so on. And many of the other women nodded in agreement. Well, I couldn't let that one go, so I stood up and I announced that I was a publisher of a small publishing company, but I was growing it fast, and I wanted to be in a position where my books would be of influence and would make their mark and would change the world, or some words to that effect, right? And the speaker that night was Paula Kahn, who became chief executive of Longman, and who I've been in awe of ever since. So, a few weeks later, I met up with the chair of my company. I think we still called the chairperson a chairman, even though she was a woman and all of that stuff. But I met up with her and I told her about this wonderful dinner that I'd had and this person that I'd met. And she just sort of said, "Yeah, calm down, Francis." And she chuckled at my ambition. And that was Anne Wayman. And she's always been just a little bit wiser than me. And I've really appreciated that. So here I am amongst two friends who will absolutely kill me if I bore you, put you to sleep, or make you walk out. So I am very glad to be here amongst my friends. So how did this precocious kid with what we would now call attitude end up at the Savile Club? Well, to explain that, I have to tell you a little bit about myself. I was born of Hungarian parents in Venezuela. How did that happen? They were lucky enough to have spent the war years in Switzerland, but when the war ended, the Swiss wanted all the foreigners out, and so off they went. They wanted to go to America, but there was a long queue for visas, and it was a long boat ride, and so they went to Venezuela, and I popped out. We then went to Australia. It wasn't exactly in the right direction of America, but my very, very, very Central European mother did not like Venezuela at all. So, when I was about 5, these coveted visas came along, and off we went again to America. I grew up in New Jersey, New York, California, a year in a Swiss boarding school thrown in as well. And then I went to New York University, and there I had the opportunity to go abroad for the 3rd year. Junior year abroad, it was called. And I went to the London School of Economics, and I fell hopelessly in love with London, absolutely head over heels, because it was halfway between where I'd grown up in America, where I'd never felt quite comfortable, and Hungary, where I should have grown up had there not been a Second World War. And London just was terrific. And boy, did I have fun in 1969, swinging London. But in 1971, I decided that I would stay here and do a PhD. And that was under a maverick Australian diplomat who changed careers and became an academic at UCL, University College London, in a very conservative Department of International Relations. And I learned from him a great deal. His new approach to understanding world society was that we needed to look at the bottom and look at the grassroots of society to understand how problems have emerged. So I took myself off to Northern Ireland and spent a summer pub crawling with the IRA. And that taught me a great deal. I learnt that people are often attracted to a cause because they find in the cause their own identity. And that when you're working on conflict resolution, trying to make peace, you have to take into account that you're making the guys who are busy disturbing things redundant. And that doesn't come easily. So, there I was with my new PhD, but there was a problem. The problem was, what was I going to do with the rest of my life? Yes, I had my little publishing company, which was very, very, very tiny, but how was I going to earn a living? How was I going to pay the rent? I didn't have a job, I didn't have a work permit. How could I get a work permit without a job? Because I had no experience of work, real work. So I thought, maybe I should create a job. And I looked at my bank account, my savings account. I had £1,000, which was an awful lot in those days, but not a fortune. And I thought, what could I do? I still didn't have quite the answer. But one day I found myself at lunch with some people at the London School of Economics in the senior dining room. And there was a young Ugandan Asian who'd just been thrown out of Uganda by Idi Amin. You will all have remembered that. And he had a Harvard PhD and he'd been teaching at Macquarie. But here he was suddenly with his parents, with his siblings, in a refugee center somewhere in West London, penniless. And he told the story of what it felt like being a refugee. And I thought, you could write a really good book about this. You could write a Penguin special. Do you all remember Penguin specials? They came out really quick and they were short and they were interesting. And then suddenly, I have no idea why, I said, I'll tell you what, I'll publish the book if you write it. I'll give you £200 as an advance on royalties, because I felt so sorry for the guy. And if you write the book and finish it before I figure out how to set up a publishing company, I will let you keep the advance. He wrote the book in 3 weeks. I figured out how to set up a publishing company in 3 weeks. And 3 months later, we published the book. And that was happening in the days when publishing books was taking 12 to 18 months. And an equally young Peter Hennessy, now Lord Hennessy, reviewed it for the Sunday Times. Wow, I thought, publishing's a doddle. This is really easy stuff, isn't it? I was having such fun. And there's a postscript to the story. A filmmaker in India read the book, and she was so enthralled, she told herself she just had to meet the author. So she met the author, they got married, and they've been living happily ever after, ever since. And as Paul and Anne will tell you, I'm a hopeless romantic. I just love that story. So the author was Mahmood Mamdani, who is a professor at Columbia, and he's regularly voted in the top 50 or 100 lists of prominent intellectuals around the world by publications like Prospect and others. And yet everything that he has to say, and has had to say in his discipline and books he's written, stems from that experience that he had as a young man suddenly becoming a refugee. Now, my own story is far less dramatic, but nevertheless very much one of rootlessness. I've been pulled towards Europe, but at the same time repelled by its bloody history. I first went to Eastern Europe by train for a month with 3 other students, women, each of us with our backpacks. And it was really quite unusual what we did. We went through behind the Iron Curtain, behind the Iron Wall, from East Berlin all the way down to Yugoslavia. And that was all by train. Last month, I took a trip to Ukraine, which also was by train, because there are no commercial flights to Ukraine. But going back to 1970, and looking back over the last 50 plus years, I've observed what it feels like, looks like, to live with deficits of freedom and security in many, many countries. And I guess I'm particularly sensitive to this because my parents always told me that my name, Frances, means freedom. It was something that we as a family cherished. But back then, in the 70s, having fallen into publishing by accident and armed with a work permit, I still had to earn a living. And I thought, well, I needed an academic job because these were really cushy numbers. They were very relaxed. You didn't have to work very hard. You had very long holidays. You could do all sorts of things, like run a publishing company on the side. So that was what I decided to do. So I thought, well, jobs in international relations don't come up that often, so I'll apply to absolutely everything that's going. And I applied to a job as a criminologist at the Center for Criminological Research in Oxford. And I am not quite sure what happened, but I think they were so struck by the audacity of somebody from such a discipline that's so far away to apply for this job that they interviewed me. So there I argued that the theory of deterrence, whether you're talking about dropping nuclear bombs or deterring criminals committing crime on the streets, the theory of deterrence was more or less the same, and therefore I could do this job. And they hired me. So that was a great win for interdisciplinarity, which we now talk about a lot. And that was good fun, because I spent 3 years in running a project which required going to high security prisons interviewing murderers and rapists. So that was another bit of learning for me. And then eventually I bought a house. I filled it with, I took out a mortgage, I filled it with tenants, and I used the rental income to put into the company so that I could grow the company. And I was publishing some of the newer ideas around interdisciplinarity. And that was great fun. And along the way, I was enjoying the London lifestyle of a young publisher, and even had a little office in what was then still affordable Covent Garden. And then one day, in 1991, the phone rang. And a man I didn't know, called George Soros, was on the line. This was about a year before he gained such notoriety for having broken the pound. You may recall when we left the ERM, and he made $1 billion. You'll be pleased to know that he still spends most of his fortune on his foundation, which spends about $1.5 billion dollars a year on promoting democracy, open society, freedom, etc. So anyway, he was on the phone and he said, I'm building a new university in Central Europe, it's 1991, and a university needs a press, right? Well, I said, yeah. And he told me that he'd been to see the head honchos of Oxford University Press. And they said, well, it's been about 500 years since we set up OUP, we can't quite remember how to do it, but we'll send you to somebody who set up an academic press within living memory. And so they sent him to me, and that's how we met. I set up the press remotely for him and continued my life in London. And then in 1994, he phoned again. And this I will never forget. It was 10 to 8, I was putting on my coat, going out to dinner with my husband, and he said he hoped he wasn't disturbing me so late in the evening. So I said, no. And he said, wouldn't it be a good idea if we translated all of the classics of the humanities and social sciences of the West into all of the languages of the post-communist countries. And I said, yes, that's a good idea. And then he said, can you do it? I took a deep breath and I said, yes. And I could immediately see how to do it, what had to be done, and also what this would mean for my life. So I went out to dinner with my husband and said, life would change. I had to sell my company. I had to move to Budapest, which was the hub of the foundation in Europe. And we would have to have a commuter marriage. I'm pleased to say I'm still married to the same man. So I saw how the Soros investment could help us work with the newly emerging publishing sector, and that these new companies could be publishing some really valuable work. And so it was all the Soviet Union, Central and Eastern Europe, and we threw in Mongolia as well. And it was designed to give these new publishers a leg up in their new market economies. How simple we thought the world was then. Anyway, I set up the Center for Publishing Development in Budapest, and had publishing coordinators in each of our local national foundations, and in big countries with big languages we translated 3,000 titles, and smaller ones 300, but everybody got some books that still to this day influence their educational systems. And we also found that there were needs to do lots of other things. We were watching the crumbling of the state apparatus right in front of our eyes. And so we ran massive programs, including loaning money to the Russian state to prop up their textbook program. So we picked up the pieces where the pieces were crumbling. We set up the world's largest library consortium. We delivered digital content to people all over the region, negotiating good deals with Western publishers, etc. And we found that Russians were very hungry for knowledge in those days. And one project was to create the first, so we called it, non-ideologically distorted encyclopedia in the Russian language. And this was to be a mix of translations from the Collier's Encyclopedia and specially commissioned work in the Russian language, put it together, and eventually, as things were moved on, the Russians would take over from the English translations. And I hired a man called Anatoly Yakovlev. Now, Anatoly was the son of Alexander Yakovlev. Alexander was Gorbachev's right-hand man and credited with developing the concepts of glasnost and perestroika. So I had some lovely meetings with him, as you can imagine. But Alexander's grandson, Seryozha, is now the subject of a sad book by Masha Geeson called The Future is History, published in 2017, where she tracks the lives of 4 30-something-year-old Russians and how they became disillusioned with the Western hope of Russia being integrated into the world of democratic nations. It's a very sad story. And poor Alexander would be rolling over in his grave. But back then, I had 250 people, well, under Anatoly, working on this massive encyclopedia. And the older people wanted this to be produced in beautiful printed volumes, just like the old-time encyclopedias. And I said no, because reference publishing was going through a huge revolution, and we knew what was coming. And so in 2000, we published it first on CD-ROM and then eventually online with support from advertising, so it was free at the point of use. But in 2000, I went to the launch, very glitzy launch of the CD-ROM. Ministers there, everybody was very happy. And I took the last flight out from Russia, from Moscow, that evening, and I ran into a young man, a fresh-faced kid, who said, "I'm a student. I'm selling pens so that I can live. I don't have enough money. Would you buy a pen?" And I looked at him and I said, "Do you have access to a computer?" And he said, "Yes, at the university, but obviously I don't have a computer." So I said, "Okay." I took out a CD-ROM and I said to him, "I just spent $3 million making this for you." Well, you can imagine what he thought. And then I said, "And I'm going to buy a pen." So I bought a pen as well. But earlier in the day, a librarian said something that really stuck in my mind and has resonated ever since. She said that this encyclopedia showed that history is made by people, not by ideologies. I thought, that rings so true, and it still rings true. Books in all countries are political. Now, whether you're talking about the book bannings that are going on in the United States, or some of the dreadful things that happen to books under authoritarian regimes, books have a strange power. And we at the Foundation commissioned a bunch of Russian educators to rewrite the Russian textbooks so that they were a bit more balanced than they were under the Soviet times. And this came under extreme attack by the right-wingers, even in the Duma, which is their parliament. And the parliament, some of the liberal parliamentarians, actually carried our books into parliament and said, "Look at these books. They're by Russians. They're good books. They're better produced than anything we had when we went to school." And yet today, as we speak, those very books are being burnt. And they're being burnt not for their content, but because they were sponsored by a foreigner who stands for everything that the current regime despises. But Moscow in the 90s was great fun, I can tell you. I had a chauffeur, I had a translator with me all the time. I went all over the place. Other assignments were not so comfortable. Taking a group of Kazakh publishers to a training center in Lake Isiku in Kyrgyzstan. Neighboring countries should be easy. But somebody discovered that it would be cheaper to hire a mid-20th century bomber plane to take us over 8,000 feet mountains and then drop down to this lake in Kyrgyzstan. So we did that, but the navigator was making himself a cup of tea, boiling water on an open flame in this airplane, and I thought, if I ever prayed, this is the moment. And then one day in Ulaanbaatar, I'll tell you lots of stories about Mongolia, but I'll just tell you one. I set up shop in the French cafe. It was the only place you could get decent food, and only wine and cheese. So I had a week of wine and cheese. Okay. Imported by a very colorful Croatian emigre. And I was told that textbooks weren't reaching the countryside. Systems had broken down. Supply chain. Do you think we have supply chain problems now? You should see what it was then in the post-communist countries. Well, so I thought, well, this has to be fixed. So I came up with a scheme whereby cashmere traders would go out with empty vans to pick up cashmere in the countryside, and then they'd come back with their cashmere. So I did a deal. I said, you take our books out in your van, and I gave them lots of positive publicity for this. And so the books got out into the countryside through the cashmere traders. And I thought, well, I have to test one of these routes, right? So I found myself hitching a ride and ended up in a yurt, you know, those round provisional tents, not terribly strong structures. Anyway, I was there sleeping on the ground with 6 men and trying to digest something totally unrecognizable that had been given to us to eat. On the way back, we got stopped by a roadblock, and we were told that the area we'd just come from had the Black Plague. Well, this was something I could have done without knowing. So, Paula, how much time have I got? I know you started late, so do you want me to cut some of these
Well,
this
we
out?
would like to leave time for questions, so 5 minutes?
5 more minutes. So I'm going to leave out hitching rides going to Kosovo from Macedonia and walking across borders and all of that. I'm probably going to skip some of the work that I did with open access, which is, I'll say a little bit about that and then I'll get to Ukraine. So, having seen many empty libraries and then watching the digital conversion, but content not being available because they're still behind paywalls, there is this movement called open access, which has become very much, it's becoming the norm of how scientific, academic, intellectual university work is published. And that arose out of a study done in 2012, the Finch report, that said publicly funded research must be made publicly available. And that makes sense. It's just switching the business model from A to B is really difficult around the world within different business cultures. But I set up something called Knowledge Unlatched, which trialed a very basic idea, which was that the question that I wanted to test was, should a collective of libraries, by pooling their funds together that they normally spend on buying books individually, e-books, pay for access by way of paying for the publishing costs in advance? And could publishers do this? Would they like this model? Because it reduced their risk. But they took them into the unknown because then they didn't know how many print books they would sell. But it's moving along nicely. Had lots of interesting jobs over the last 15 years. Set up Bloomsbury Academic, CEO of Manchester University Press, digitized the Churchill archives, which was fantastically interesting. But most recently, I set up something called SUPRA. What does SUPRA stand for? It's spelled SUPRR, and it stands for Supporting Ukrainian Publishing Resilience and Recovery. And here, this came out of thinking with my fellow publishers, friends, what could we contribute to help Ukrainian publishers survive the war and then thrive later after the war, after they become members of the EU. And so we run a whole set of programs, which, if you're interested, there's a website, supra.org, and if you want to know more about that, please contact me. But in October, I went to Ukraine, and I went to the Lviv Book Forum, and this is something like a literary festival, and it's quite extraordinary to hold something like this in wartime conditions. But if you're interested, there were some sessions in English or translated simultaneously, and it's on the Hay Festival website, HAY, that we're all familiar with. And obviously this experience is still very vivid in my mind. And I wrote a letter to a 93-year-old Hungarian Jewish friend of mine who's taken an interest in my publishing work. And I wanted to close this presentation by reading to you what I wrote on the 11th of October, which was a day after the close of the Lviv Book Forum. Lviv is a lively and cultured Central European city with a disproportionate number of outdoor cafes and restaurants, all distinctly and creatively decorated. They all close early, however, because everyone's making their way home because of the curfew. And the first thing that I was shown in my lovely hotel, Leopolis, was the bomb shelter, even before I was shown my room. And the Lviv Book Forum itself was held in a 16th century building called the Powder Tower. It was originally constructed to hold ammunition, but now it's a funky conference center, complete with an art gallery and a cafe. And outside, publishers were selling their books from tents, and the locals just loved it. They just desperately wanted to see and buy the new books that somehow or another these publishers had managed to produce. On the evening of Saturday, the 7th of October, the afternoon of the 7th, I visited a makeshift graveyard for soldiers. It was on land that must have once been a very, very large car park just outside the city's main cemetery. Each grave was flooded with fresh flowers, clearly tended, and pictures of the young men were on every grave, as were 10-foot-high Ukrainian flags, on every single one of them billowing in the wind. There's just enough room between each grave for a small bench where relatives could sit and mourn. Every city and town has a similar graveyard. And yet, in Lviv, the town was buzzing. Designer shops, children playing, everyone smiling, displaying grit while hiding their fears and tears. I worried a bit on that Saturday. It was Putin's birthday, and I'd recently heard a lecture from an American professor, a Putin expert. He said Putin was known for doing especially cruel things a week earlier. Well, Lviv had been bombed the week earlier, so I thought we were safe, but what about the rest of the country? Putin was probably licking his lips, though, on that day that Hamas attacked Israel, creating more global chaos. That evening, I was at the opera watching La Traviata. I mean, who would think you're at the opera in a war zone? I'd seen the opera at the Bolshoi in Moscow a quarter of a century earlier, in a very different world. And I looked down from my box seat and I thought, something looks odd here. And then it hit me. The audience was made up mostly of women. The men were fighting on the battlefront. There were no tourists. As with all the work I do, building up and brokering trust is essential. Framing the assistance that we're doing through Supra. It's not a charity. It's just an opportunity for Ukrainian publishers to build bridges with their publishing peers in the West as they go down the hard road of EU accession. In the process, they learn the way we've all learned and continue to do so from one another. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Francis. A quick survey of some of the things you've done. I know there's much more. And centering on that critical area for all of us, which is the huge changes in Europe that we have experienced in our lifetime. And I think it's particularly relevant, isn't it, to roughly our age group, in that we remember those different chunks of time as Europe opened up, closed down, transformed, and Francis was there for all of them. So questions? Anybody have questions? Any new questions?
Frank, I've got a mic from there, but it doesn't seem to be, I don't know if it's working. What do you think? Yeah, you do. I could
You
shout.
had the hand up?
Lots of shouting.
Can't see anybody.
Any of you?
Oh, there's one. There's
Thank you for a most interesting talk. I was rather embarrassed at the thought of raising my hand, but I decided since nobody else would do it, I would raise mine. I belong to one of the creative writing groups at iU3A, and my background, strangely enough, is not very dissimilar to your own. And I was just talking to my colleagues here this morning and criticising myself for continually resorting to autographical writing, which is my background, and wishing that I could be a little more imaginative and apply it in the third person or whatever. I'm really only asking you is, would you condone the fact that I continue to write at my on stage in an autobiographical way, because you implied or stated that most writing stems from oneself, and I just wondered if you could give me an opinion about somebody working within a group, a creative writing group, how they should approach their own writing.
Well, that's a very interesting point, because I hope I didn't give that impression, actually, at least for me. I have to say, this is the first time I've ever talked about myself. Usually I'm doing teaching about how to get published, or what is open access, and professional things in publishing. I've never been asked to do exactly what I've just done, and so it's very new to me, although people do occasionally say I should write a memoir. I have heard this, excuse me, I have heard this from writers, that really good writing does come from within, but it depends on what you want to do with your writing, who you want to address your writing to. As a publisher, I always say consider your reader. What is it that you want to achieve by writing in an autobiographical voice? But there's nothing wrong with it. I mean, it's a well known way of approaching saying something that you hope others want to read.
That's good enough. Thank you.
Any other questions? Yes, there's one.
Thank you.
Hello, my name's John Rogers. I wanted to know whether you made any money out of your publishing.
That's really interesting. The answer is no. But I didn't. I'm not impoverished either. In the early days, I liked to, when I could, if it was possible, after the company got to a certain level, I liked to peg my salary to what an average academic would get of my level. I thought that was fair, because academics were always saying publishers are so rich, and actually none of them were, except for very few, and not in academic publishing. But a lot of the work I've been doing is in the not-for-profit world, so I get a salary, but not, or I set something up myself, and then I do it on a shoestring until somebody else takes it over and puts real money into it, but not to me. Is that enough of an answer to that question? I wish I were a multimillionaire, but I'm not.
wrong side of this.
You've got such amazing insight and watching publishing develop over time and all the different spheres of publishing. My impression is that we in the UK or we in the West have this absolute explosion of information, free information all the time at the click of a button. And I'm watching with anxiety and great concern that my children do not read books because they don't need to read books, it's all on a screen and they wouldn't pay for information. So if you were sort of a youngster of 20, would you be generally optimistic about the future in terms of publishing, or do you think there's just so much information and it's all free? You know, how do you then penetrate that volume of information with new thoughts and original discussions?
So the way this discussion goes inside the publishing industry is that we have a USP, which is brand recognition. And while, yes, we have had this immense explosion, eventually, already people are beginning to realize that they have to go to trusted sources. And that's where a publishing brand comes in. And also there is a job to be done to train young people in information literacy. I don't know whether I'm just an optimist, but my sense is it will get better because it will get a lot worse. And then when it does get to be really impossible, it's almost there, there will have to be steps taken. But, you know, when you talk about books, you talk about print or digital, but then when you talk about digital, you talk about behind or in front of a paywall. And that's where I think some lines need to be drawn, which are being drawn now, between the content that should be made available free to the end user, and that where a writer should be able to expect a reasonable return on their investment as a writer. But just like the music industry, the world of the writer is changing, and everybody thought